McDermott. This is the first show of 2021. We're out of 2020, thank God.
Yep, thank God.
Into 2021 and light at the end of the tunnel. With me tonight is a great guy, a great guest, Mikey Marquart, who I'm going to introduce to you in a moment. Just my furniture moving bit, as they call it in the business. Just to remind you, it's a live show. Be lovely to have your input. I've got my team looking at the various platforms that we stream on, which are YouTube, Facebook, and on Twitter through Periscope. So if we pick up any comments, they'll message them through to me. So if you see me pick up my phone and look at it, I'm not being rude. I'm just looking at the questions as they come in. And talking about my phone, you can also call if you like, and have a chat, and we'll get you on air. I'll make you famous. There you go. And the number to call is +44 7506 319 745. That's +44 7506 319 745. And you can call me on WhatsApp if you want to save the charges. Of course, if you're calling from anywhere in Europe, you won't get any charges. Okay, great. Mikey, hello.
Hey, Noel, how's it going?
It's all right. It's good to see you. It feels like actually ages since I've sort of sat with you. We met almost 2 years ago, is it now? I want to say.
Has it been 2 years? Like, that's crazy.
It was the summer before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's accurate. That seems like just yesterday we were meeting, but it was such a long time ago.
Yeah. You were over because your partner was working, and you'd come along as a good egg to support her and encourage her and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And a mutual friend said, "Oh, you'll like this guy, Mikey. Why don't you reach out to him and go and have a coffee with him?" And that mutual friend was right.
I'm so glad he referred us together.
Yeah, so I do remember having a great deal of fun walking around Charing Cross Road and all the music shops just there by the church and all that sort of stuff, and getting to know you and getting to know what an interesting guy you are. So you're a musician, a producer. You're based in Los Angeles in California, and you're also in recovery as well.
Yes.
And it's because of that combination. And I wouldn't mind just kicking off, I suppose, with how things are going for you. We want to catch up with people during the pandemic and how you're managing. And California, like the UK, has had a spike recently of numbers, haven't you?
Yeah, it seems to be getting worse by the day, unfortunately.
Right.
You've
had a bit of a close call yourself, haven't you?
We've had a couple.
Yeah.
A lot of people kind of in our circle got infected, and they were with us, and we thankfully didn't get it, and have been staying as safe and healthy as possible. But it's almost to the point where it's almost kind of, your little pod, and anything outside of that is too much of a risk.
Yeah.
And so you kind of need to keep it simple and, make safety the highest priority.
And how are you finding that, Mikey?
It's, it was easier in the beginning. We're fortunate in the fact that we have enough space to kind of add a gym, have a lot of kind of areas to kind of change up the scenery a little bit. Able to work out. And so we've been faring really well. We have our dogs that keep us really good company. And occasionally my parents live in Malibu, which is like 30 miles away or 30 minutes away. And so it's been nice, but the longer it's gone on, we kind of expected the cases to kind of slow down a little bit, but unfortunately with the holidays, things have just been increasing, and hospitals are, forming those restrictions. Yeah. And it's scary,
I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, from our side, it also looks like, California, I think, has been quite on the ball, hasn't it? In many ways as a state. It's just sort of had a very clear policy about what's going on. Does it feel like he still has, or does it feel like he's losing it now?
I think they're making adjustments where they feel like they need to.
Right.
I feel bad for the small businesses and restaurants in the area that, made, substantial investments to accommodate for the outside eating, that unfortunately, like, they're not allowed to be open right now. We try to support, our local small restaurants and ordering from them as much as we can, but it's, I feel bad for them, and,
Yeah. But both you and your partner, Jess, you both work in the music industry, which has been heavily hit by this whole process. I mean, because I know we were planning to meet up again at the beginning of this year because of sort of music stuff that you were doing, but then that all just got cancelled and trashed.
It did, and we were in London kind of right before the travel ban. And so we kind of saw an opportunity to kind of be home, not really knowing what was actually going to happen. And, it turned out this whole coronavirus pandemic, was really affecting the whole world. But it's really affected us, thankfully, like, we took the time as artists to kind of focus on, building up our skills in other areas that we wanted to focus on. Like for me, I took kind of a deep dive into guitar.
Great.
And I've had so much fun doing that. And
that's right, because we were looking at guitars when we met. You were having a look at guitars, and so you managed to get one in the end.
I managed to get one, and I started taking lessons, Zoom lessons, 3 days a week, and it's been such a godsend. My dad would always tell me, I'm never alone with a guitar, and now I know what he's been saying, and it's been such a great, to have that with me.
Yeah, because your father was a very successful musician as well, wasn't he? He was in various bands. I think Flock of Seagulls was one.
Flock of Seagulls, and Tokio Rose, which is a kind of American-based rock and roll band back in the day.
So what was that like, growing up with a rock and roll hero? What was that must be quite interesting as a boy, looking at his dad doing that stuff.
It was, and it was even more interesting kind of asking his perspective of that, having a family, but also being on the road. I mean, when I was young, I remember all the bandmates, looking after me, and we had a studio in the bottom of our house, and, the whole band was there, and all the shenanigans associated with that, and I was like, well, that explains everything, with me. But it's like, I look at those old videos of him, being in that band, and I just saw the happiness on his face, and I was like, that's what I need to do. Just kind of authentic, pure passion and love for what he was doing. And I share that with him.
And you enjoyed that then, that whole experience? I imagine I would have done if I was a boy around all of that sort of stuff. It would have been absolutely sort of fantasy land in some ways.
Yeah, I wish I remembered more, but like, from what I do remember, it's like I was having a blast, and I still stay in contact with some of the guys from back then that live in LA, and I mean, just really sweet, great guys that kind of helped raise me as a kid.
And did you have brothers and sisters? I can't remember.
I have 3 younger sisters.
Right. And were they also, was your dad still doing that stuff? Did they get involved in that stuff? Is it something you shared, or?
So my older sister, the oldest of the 3, she went down the music route as well. She had that same passion, and, and she's the one that runs the recording studio now in Santa Monica.
Great. And is that where your dad moved into the production and the recording and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so he initially started this recording studio kind of right after he got off tour with the Flock of Seagulls.
Right.
I think him being away from his family kind of had a bigger impact on him, and he's been on the road for like 30 plus years. And wanting to find something musical, but staying in one place. And so he started a recording studio in Virginia Beach called Windmark Recording, and built it from the ground up. And so, me and my sisters kind of would go there and play, hang out, not really knowing kind of what was going on there, but, kind of grew up in that environment.
Yeah.
And it was great.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you miss him when he was touring, all that sort of stuff? Or was it like, this is what my dad does? And
Yeah, I don't really remember that much.
Right.
Thankfully, I was young enough to, kind of not really know. But, my mom was there and, most of my memories are of when he was, had the recording studio in Virginia Beach.
Right. So mum was the solid attachment person. She was the one that was always there and you would go to and you formed the relationship with.
Yeah.
Cool. And where was that? You were based in California? No.
So we were based in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Right.
Both sides of my family are from Wisconsin.
Okay.
And that's where I was born. And my older sister was born, and then we moved to Virginia. And then that's kind of where I grew up.
Okay.
And
I'm trying to figure out, because I'm sort of in the wrong part of the world, but Virginia's in Southern America. Is that right?
East Coast, Southern America. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So below Florida, as it were.
Above Florida.
Above Florida. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I've been to Florida. I drove from Florida to California once. So I went through, sort of did that whole sort of thing.
Oh,
so,
nice.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, America's an awesome place, actually. I mean, sort of, it was absolutely brilliant sort of experience, and I'd encourage everybody to do it when we're allowed to travel again. Is that sort of it's an extraordinary country, actually. Really is, and the people are amazing, and were extraordinarily kind and polite and helpful, and everywhere I went, it was just incredibly friendly, which is a bit of a cliche about America, but it was the truth. It really was the truth. So nice and polite. And I've never been called sir so many times in my life. And I was like, I found it a bit strange. I was sort of, in the UK, we only call people sir if they're sort of like in the army or old. So I was like, hang on, why are you calling me sir? But it's a sort of normal. Yeah, it was amusing. So when did you get hooked into doing music yourself then? What sort of happened for you?
I was 12 years old, and my dad had a drum set up above the garage, and he kind of made me learn piano initially as the first instrument to kind of, appreciate the theory behind it. I wish I would have paid more attention back then, but I wasn't, interested in piano, and so I saw this drum set and I was like, I want to do that. And he, gave me one lesson, taught me the basic beat, 4 on the floor, and handed me a Bon Jovi CD and was like, go to town. And from then on, it's like, that was like a daily occurrence of my life.
Bon Jovi would be a good way to learn the drums, to be honest.
Yeah.
That's a really cool way of doing it. I mean, we share that because I do drumming as well. So that was always my laugh. And I haven't been able to do it in years because I think I'd get killed if I had a drum kit in my home. It's one of the most antisocial. It's totally antisocial, but I get it. I'm really hooked on it. So and so you started at 12, you start learning it and you start getting on with it, and sort of and that was your passion then? You knew at that point?
It was something that I was passionate about. I never actually thought of it as something I wanted to go into a career with.
Okay.
It's just something I was incredibly passionate and obsessed with. And kind of as technology kind of advanced, there were more websites that, this website, drummerworld.com, I would kind of go on and, see different tutorials and kind of learn by watching. And that really helped. But mostly I found artists that I really appreciated the drumming or wanted to learn more of that style. And I listened to it over and over again until I could kind of figure out generally what they were doing. And that's kind of how I learned.
Right. And it's quite hard work, actually, drumming. It does require, it's one of those instruments that requires a lot of practice and a lot of trying things out.
Yeah.
And it can get very complex as well. It can get sort of, so when was your first band? What sort of age were you when you then thought, right, I'm going to do something with this?
It wasn't until after college where I really kind of was like, this is what I want to do. And that kind of goes back into, me getting sober and my kind of recovery process. Because I always thought I would go into some sort of corporate business, join the family business or something like that.
Yeah.
All my kind of graduate degrees from college were business related. And I was in Southern California trying to get sober, and it was kind of wild. Like one of the conditions of my sober living was I needed to have a job or be in school.
Okay.
And for the life of me, no one would hire me, which was wild. I had a bachelor's degree, and I was like, like the AT&T store was shutting their door.
Okay, right.
And I was like, what's going on? And I just started thinking like, maybe this is time for a shift and go back to school. And that's when I, signed up for LA recording school.
Right.
And
let's loop back a bit because when did you start using? When was that happening?
So that happened early on. I was born with an unknown blood disorder. Okay. And one of the symptoms of that was I don't heal in my extremities. So I was in and out of the hospital a lot as a kid,
wow. Yeah.
Inadvertently kind of being addicted to painkillers as a result. And so I think that is what kind of lit the fire of where my brain kind of associated the pain pills to happiness and euphoria,
right?
Instead of as a pain reduction method.
Yeah.
And I think it just started from there.
That must have been quite frightening. What sort of age were you being admitted into hospital from then?
So it was when I was 6, I was actually diagnosed with leukemia. It was before they actually found out what it was. And it was kind of after the leukemia diagnosis where my family was like, that can't be right. Let's get a second opinion. And Duke University found out I have an unknown type of anemia. And it doesn't kind of follow the stereotypical anemic kind of symptoms or treatments.
Right.
It kind of, all my blood levels kind of fluctuate and my platelets are deformed, and it kind of looked more like a leukemic type of disorder. But I don't heal in my extremities, which was also really strange.
So I'm just trying to imagine that, because that I'm sort of just thinking about the onset of trauma. I know trauma is a big part of your story, and
it is.
I guess with a diagnosis of leukemia, it's such a serious illness. A childhood leukemia is such a serious illness that they thought you must have been sort of constantly on edge when you're going into these hospitals in terms of how people are viewing you as somebody who's critically ill. Because that's what a diagnosis leukemia says. You're critically ill. You're like, you may die. And that's a very strong message to get when you're a small child. Is that what it was like? You were getting those types of messages?
It was. I think more of the damage kind of, I guess, emotionally kind of came after the fact when it was an unknown type of anemia. The fact that I had this disorder that no one knew what it was or, what caused it was it kind of instilled that core belief that there was something wrong with me. And, I carried that, for decades.
And so you were prescribed, I should imagine, quite heavy-ended sort of painkillers to deal with this on the sort of codeine scale in the that type of drug, or?
Probably some of the most powerful prescription opiates, because the treatment I ended up hurting my shin when I was a kid. I bashed it on a barnacle when I was kind of climbing up back onto the dock, and it got infected, kind of, like those things normally happen. And it was treated, but it never healed. And so part of the treatment was a debridement and a skin graft. And the first guy that did a full thickness skin graft, which is probably one of the most painful ones. But that was the treatment. And so we did that. And I went back to the doctor for a just to see how it's going, and the skin graft melted off. Wow. And but as those types of surgeries, they give you, I was on dilaudid buttons and really high powered, stuff for a month. And then they'd send me home with, painkillers as well. So my body would just naturally get addicted over and over and over again.
Well, that's very much, you had a very young, undeveloped brain at that point as well. And so your brain is being trained into sort of needing these things. But did anybody talk to your family about that at the time and say, well, there are some worries about doing this? Or were they just like, yeah, give him in, don't worry about it?
Yeah, not that I know of. As far as I remember, there wasn't a lot of concern with the medications I was on after I was discharged from the hospital. It was almost kind of a regular event where I'd get discharged after a month at the hospital and then finish up the prescription that they gave me, and then I detox at the house. And and then the whole process would go over again when another injury happened. So it was just kind of like that reoccurring cyclical event through most of my childhood.
So that was from like about 6 onwards, or was it happening before 6 as well?
So I think 12 or 14 was my first skin graft surgery.
Wow. I mean, it's really must have been so frightening for you, that sort of the separation, the surgeries, and also then just I'm imagining, I don't know, but I'm imagining your mum was really stressed out by it and really worried as well, and she was seeing her baby boy bashed around and couldn't do anything about it, and also they didn't know what was going on as well, that you were getting these diagnoses. And
I mean, I can't imagine what my parents went through. It must have just been so hard, especially having to, I was big into sports, and having to, I couldn't play contact sports anymore. And, I couldn't do anything that potentially risked an injury. It was tough for sure.
And did that lead you to, I imagine, to be quite isolated from your peer group as well, and your friends at college and school and stuff like that?
It did, because probably a lot of times at school I'd leave to go to the hospital for a month and then come back. And, so I did thankfully have a good group of friends in my neighborhood.
Right.
But athletically, I switched to tennis.
Right.
No kind of contact, and I really loved it. And so I kind of focused all my energy on playing tennis.
Okay. So that sounds quite a creative response as well, that you sort of didn't give up. You found something that you could do.
Yeah.
Is that really part of who you are? I mean, is that a character trait, you would say?
It is. I've always kind of been able to find the positive and no matter what was happening, and a way to kind of adapt to the limitations to still pursue things that I wanted. And it's, looking back, it's, it's kind of, I was incredibly proud of myself for doing that, but it's a wild child, wild story, that.
Yeah. And when did you, sort of, nobody was thinking there's a problem with the medication because doctors are giving it to you. And actually, to be honest, it's a story I've heard so many times, that the overprescribing, and particularly of pain meds, that we now know is a disaster. And
what was interesting was I would be on these really high level injection based narcotics in the hospital. And then when I was released, the medication that they gave me was very minimal. Like it was kind of a 10 steps down level wise. So it's kind of my body kind of immediately went into withdrawals. So it was interesting kind of how they set that up. There wasn't really a wean time off of the gnarlier medications.
I think, to be honest, I think they just didn't get it in those days. I mean, I think now they would, but they didn't get it. So how did you cope with that? I mean, what was your responses? Did you start to look for extra drugs? Did you start to look for street drugs? I mean, what happened?
I started looking in my parents' medicine cabinet, medications at home. In high school, thankfully, I was so preoccupied with whether it was playing drums or going to the gym or playing tennis. Those were my priorities, that at the time drugs and alcohol didn't play that huge of a role until I went to college, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, which is interesting, because I mean, I'm a great advocate of the fact that certain types of activities are really, really inherently healthy. So I would always encourage people to get involved in the arts, whatever form of the arts, because it's inherently healthy. You're agreeing, that's your experience.
Absolutely. Especially just having that something you're working towards, you know, that end of the line goal, you know, I don't know, it does wonders for me emotionally, and it still does. It's a huge part of my life.
I find it very odd that it isn't used more in treatment, both mental health and addiction treatment. That, you know, I've visited various places that do have music studios, and it's just great when you do, because it's a lifesaver. Or arts in general, painting, music, theatre, acting, movement, all of these things are absolutely crucial. So they sort of, you had those outlets of managing your feelings, these difficult feelings. You had creative expressions for them, and also then the healthy sort of physical gym exercise stuff. And then you go to college and something happens there, which those things are no longer sustaining. So what's the next step for you?
You know, and it's, what's so funny is that I actually chose a college based on its party ranking in the United States. I wasn't really great at school, you know, so I wanted to go to college, obviously, but it wasn't an academic venture for me. It was more of the party, you know, so I picked a great school that, you know, thankfully had a great academic, you know, track record, but my goal there was to kind of get a master's in drinking, unfortunately.
Okay, that's an interesting master's choice.
That's just how I was. Yeah.
And so what, you started drinking almost from day one or something? You went in, but you hadn't been much of a drinker before that, had you?
No, but my drinking experiences at the end of at the end of high school, if they did happen, they didn't end well. You know, they were, you know, it was kind of more of the binge drinking event. I took advantage of that time to drink as much as I could. And
so those are the early indications that there's a problem with your drinking, because most people, they can drink and then leave it alone, but not to blackout and not to the jail cell and all that sort of stuff. But you were having some of these early signs, but you sort of, you didn't really notice them. And then you go to college, and do wheels come off immediately, or did it take a bit of time?
It was a gradual progression until the wheels fully came off. But I ended up joining a fraternity with all of my buddies, and that's kind of where everything kind of hit its peak. And I remember being in kind of my apartment by myself and thinking like, oh, okay, there's a party tonight, and okay, well then I could start drinking a couple hours before. And then I remember sitting like at 9 a.m. in my apartment, like, well, why do I have to wait till then to start drinking? And that was the kind of the beginning of the end. I started drinking 24 hours a day.
Yeah, I remember when that happened to me. Sort of like, the veils lifted on the idea that it was a social event, and then well, you moved more into drinking alone and just drinking to blackout, and
drinking alone to kind of feel normal. Little did I know I was, also suffering from PTSD that I didn't even recognize, and I was kind of trying to cover up those symptoms to try to live somewhat of a normal life outside of my apartment.
Right.
Do
you remember those symptoms? Are you okay to talk about them, about what was happening for you?
For sure. High levels of anxiety. That core belief of knowing that something was wrong with me because I felt broken with all those kind of misdiagnoses of my, my disease, it just added to my self-confidence grew when I drank. So I needed that. Without it, I had none. I was scared to death to leave, to go out anywhere. I just massive amounts of anxiety, poor self-esteem, lack of self-confidence, and those PTSD traits definitely accelerated later in life. But that's what I remember kind of dealing with the most.
Yeah. And did you have things like nightmares and intrusive memories or any of those things, or did they come later, that sort of thing?
It came later, those flashbacks that would hit me were really tough. But
But,
that didn't come
it's
till.
interesting because heavy drinking itself is a symptom of PTSD.
Yeah.
It's one of the diagnostic criteria. So you had classic signs at that point, absolutely classic signs. And also, I'm slightly annoyed because it's almost inevitable that you would have had it. And I want to know why those medics who were treating you were not going, this is going to be traumatizing this boy. And that we need to be thinking about that now.
My therapist now describes me, before I really kind of took a deep dive into my trauma, as being very polished. And I think I had that trait when I was younger, that the outside of me looked fine and perfect, covering up a lot of this emotional and mental trauma. And I also think my parents wanted to give me as normal of a life as possible.
Sure. I get that.
Yeah.
But the health professionals, particularly the child ones, because you would have been seen by pediatric specialists. I mean, I know I'm just about to say something which is maybe unfair. Like when you talk to me now, I'm just automatically going ACE scores, adverse childhood experience.
Yeah.
And we know that adverse childhood experiences increase the risk of all sorts of things later on in life. And you were definitely having adverse childhood experiences. Nobody's fault that you were having them, but you were definitely having them. You're having a lot of separation, a lot of fear-based interventions, a lot of messages about death, dying. That's inevitably going to lead to psychological problems unless you help and treat. But nobody ever offered you that. Nobody sort of said, I understand, Mikey, that this is tough. Here's a therapist, and you should talk to them and work through some of these issues. That never happened.
So I don't remember them offering a therapist. My pediatrician was a good family friend, and he would always check in on me. And I remember him saying, after kind of one stint in the hospital, and he was like, I'm surprised this hasn't had more of an effect on you, is what he said to me.
Right, that's it. Yeah.
And I always was like, oh, okay, well then it almost validated what I was doing to kind of emotionally get through.
Yeah,
which
become self-sufficient.
Exactly.
Like, I'm responsible for this. I have to deal with this. I have the skills, and not a dependency on somebody else.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. And it was like you were being validated for being brave and strong.
Yes.
And actually, of course, you weren't. You were terrified.
For sure.
Sort of in bits. Of course you were. Oh, you poor thing. And so then when you're at university, college, we call it university, that's when this stuff begins to crash. What does your family notice? Does anybody notice this, or is it just hidden away because it looks like normal college behavior?
I mean, and I think I shielded them from what I was actually up to as much as I could.
Yeah. Like you did as a child.
Absolutely.
The trauma that was happening. No, I'm okay. Don't worry about me. I'm fine.
Yep. And it was just almost kind of that internal feeling that I had to protect them from what was actually happening, instead of wanting to protect myself. Which is interesting. But I shielded them as much as I could. They came out to games, and I was as well behaved as I needed to be. And it wasn't until I developed double pneumonia as a result of kind of my abuses. And I came home for Thanksgiving, thankfully, and I almost died in my hometown bed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Went into full cardiac arrest in my house.
Mikey, and
yeah, my mom, I remember she called me from downstairs because I wasn't down hanging out with everyone. Everyone was watching football.
Right.
And they're like, Mikey, why don't you come down, eat some appetizers and hang out and watch football? And I remember, I need to put on a good face. Like, I need to let everyone know that everything is okay. And so little did I know, I had just inhaled vomit by accident and was under full cardiac arrest and our oxygen wasn't going to my muscles, and it took me about 45 to 50 minutes just to get down the stairs.
Right.
But I made it, and I remember walking into the room where my family was, gripping this chair to stand up, and like the first thing my mom says is, Mikey, are you on drugs? And it was probably the first time I was completely honest and told her no. But I was inadvertently dying from double pneumonia that I developed in college from just being completely unhealthy and succumbing to all my addiction desires.
Yeah.
And ended up being flatlined on the table, 6 weeks in a coma, and had to,
Was that an induced coma, or it just happened because you had lack of oxygen?
Medically induced.
Medically, just to keep you alive. So they put you into coma so they could sort you out. Good God, that's extraordinary. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrifying. And it's quite horrific. And
it was, yeah. And I was hallucinating a lot as a result of the coma medication, and my health was so bad. And there's a lot of traumatic pieces in that experience that I can't separate real from fake. But I guess when it comes to trauma, it doesn't really matter.
No.
Your brain still recognizes that as a traumatic event.
Yeah, I mean, it's something people don't get about, say, any sort of psychotic experience. And psychotic just means you can't tell the difference between real and not real. It doesn't matter if it happens inside your mind strongly enough. It happened.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether it happened in the actual world that we share with everybody else. And so people can have psychotic memories that are absolutely terrifying. So somebody who in psychotic break sees the devil. That's it.
Yeah.
And it terrifies the hell out of them, literally, and they will have trauma from those experiences. So without a doubt. And so but flatlining as well is another trauma experience. I mean, that's like really extreme. You're also, I think, profoundly lucky that you did it while you were at home rather than at college, because if you'd done it at college, you wouldn't have survived, I don't think, would you?
Absolutely. If my mom didn't call me downstairs, they would have found me in my bed.
Right.
In college, zero chance of survival for sure.
No, that's an interesting point, because it's odd, because one of the things that caused the problem for you is this thing that you would put up a good front, right? But it was because you wanted to put up a good front that you saved your life.
And I tell that story all the time because it's such a fascinating thing that my stubbornness literally in that moment saved my life.
How interesting. Yeah. And that's not new. I've heard that so many times, that it's these core, I think in AA they call them defects of characters or defense mechanisms in psychology. That these things that are double-edged, aren't they? They kill us and they save us at the same time. It's really weird dynamic.
Yep, it is.
Yeah. And so was that the event then? I hope it was. That was the event that made you go, I'm doing something wrong here. I need to change.
It definitely was. And I wish that, it's unfortunately, I would have bet money that would have been the case where I was like, okay, I'm completely done. That is it. But that wasn't the case. I remember the doctor telling me, like, this is a result of your drug and alcohol use.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I couldn't speak or anything. And I just learned how to write. And I had a whiteboard and I wrote, I am never drinking again, ! Underlined. And I showed it to the doctor. And he was like, good, because or you're going to die if you don't. And I remember a month or so after I fully recovered, and I went to a party in the neighborhood with my dad, and they were handing out wine. And I remember saying, like, I want a glass of that wine. And my dad was like, are you sure? And I was like, it's one glass of red wine. Like, what's that going to do? It's going to be an accident.
Man, it's just how many times have I heard that? Just one, it's all right.
And that was it, and I took that glass of red wine, and then, there we're off again. We're off to the races,
Wow. And how long did that relapse last for?
It brought me into treatment. It's I can't remember, what that time frame was, but went to treatment, and kind of my serious attempt at recovery was started. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so you went to, I guess, a 12-step based treatment service, or
Yep.
which is
Locally.
pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
And so you were with peer group and you have group therapy, and you have to sort of learn all these skills about grassing yourself up, as we would say in the UK, and telling people the truth about what was going on for you. That must have been quite weird.
It was, and I think I was resistant. You don't
say, Mikey.
Honesty piece of it. Yeah.
I'd never have guessed. If you hadn't told me that, I'd have thought, no, this is a guy, just go in, totally comply, it'll all be fine. No.
Well, the powerlessness piece didn't hit me till years later, you know, because I just assumed that my self-will was more powerful than the drugs and the alcohol, because I had beaten all these horrible hospitalizations and medical issues on my own, that this was just going to be another obstacle I myself had to go through.
Yeah.
And that was my mentality. I was still in college. You know, I only went to treatment for, I think, a month. And they were like, you know, you should go to this sober living or halfway house type place afterwards. And I was like, absolutely not. You know, like, I'm in college. I need to go back to my frat house and whatever and not drink and get on with life. You know, it's the powerlessness piece. I never fully accepted that piece until many years later.
And what's your understanding of it now then? What would you say is your understanding of powerlessness? Mine is, there are certain things I just can't predict what's going to happen, so I better not do them, because it could be all right, it could be a train wreck, and it's just not the way I want to live my life.
For sure. And, you know, there's another saying that says, if you go in the barber shop multiple times, eventually you're going to get your hair cut.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's kind of how I feel about it too. And
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Did you do any more experimenting after that treatment though? Or was it more of the emotional resistance?
You know, well, the PTSD still was untreated and unknown to everyone outside of myself at that moment. And so kind of everything that happened after that was as a result of me trying to treat my PTSD, trying to feel comfortable in the world. And that was the form of alcohol and drugs. That was the only way I felt like I could live outside of my house, you know, a life.
Yeah. And so, I mean, again, that's a very familiar story that people are literally trying to self-medicate because they haven't got the appropriate diagnosis, they haven't got the appropriate tools, and they haven't had the appropriate treatments. Did anybody in your original treatment service suggest to you that there was some PTSD and you needed to get on with it? Right. Okay.
No, I was out of college wanting to be sober without the know-how to do so. And so I ended up finding a local, like a nutritionist. So I felt like if I healed my body from the inside, then I wouldn't have the desire to drink.
Yeah.
And so I reached out, found a local nutritionist, and it just so happens she was an addiction therapist at the same time. And just through me talking, she was like, "You have PTSD." And so that was the first kind of experience of someone telling me, "You have post-traumatic stress."
Okay.
You know, take
and
a look.
What was that like? When they talk, I was just checking the phone because there was a message come through and I was wondering if somebody had sent a message about something. So what was that like because I remember when the first time a therapist said to me, "Oh, you know, Noel, that your childhood was X, Y, and Z." And I went, "Oh my God." Because it was just my childhood. And it was like, I didn't understand that stuff. And when they said, "And you know, you've got PT," I was like, "What? Hang on. No, this is just me. I'm normal."
Yeah. You don't know, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. That must have been so wild that this person just sort of nails it and tells you what's going on.
It was. And, you know, but I really appreciated the kind of the compassion on her side of it. Right. You know, it was kind of one of those beginning moments where someone seemed to kind of understand me more than most. Right. You know, like those unsaid feelings inside someone, you know, we're noticing them, and it was kind of empowering in a way.
That makes me want to cry, Mikey. It's beautiful when that happens.
Yeah.
And like, how old were you at that point?
I was maybe 19 or 20.
So you'd spent 20 years on the planet with nobody really understanding what was going on inside.
Yeah.
That must have been such a relief to...
It was, and I mean, that still was kind of the beginning of my journey.
Right.
Even after I moved to California to really make an effort to be clean, I still never saw a therapist until I went back to treatment in Malibu.
Right.
And my first therapy experience, I'll never forget it. You know, the first 45 minutes, I'm, you know, telling my story, and I'll never forget the therapist. He goes, "You've been speaking of the worst things a human can go through for the last 40 minutes, and there wasn't a shred of emotion on your face."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, that was like almost the light bulb of, okay, now I have some serious things to work on.
That's and again, that's a prototypical trauma response, the lack of expression around really shitty things. And it's actually, I think, one of the gifts of recovery is the capacity to feel these things without it destroying us.
Yeah.
You know? And we learn that capacity, I think, partly through listening to other people and their journey, and partly through telling our story and having other people witness it. So what sort of age were you when you met this therapist and you went into this phase of your treatment?
Maybe 22, 23.
Right. You're still a really young man, which is great, because you've got so many years ahead. And so tell me about what was working for you in terms of treatment and recovery. What were the things that worked for you and helped you?
So I went to this one treatment in Malibu, Passages, which was kind of a non-12 step. It was an optional kind of 12-step experience, which was kind of nice to not have. I never found the meetings initially, it was too frightening for me in a room with a bunch of people where I'm supposed to speak publicly. Like, that was my worst case scenario.
Sure.
And it horrified me to be in public with a lot of strangers. But the therapy was great. And, you know, especially with trauma, little did I know, you know, it takes a kind of a specific therapist to help lead you on a healing journey.
That's right.
And there was a lot of therapists that I had to, you know, kind of do that trial and error thing with. Some ended up traumatizing me even more as a result.
I mean, that's the real risk of people who don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
So what sort of form of therapy? I mean, typically now we would recommend things like EMDR. Rewind is another form of therapy that we would recommend. What sort of things worked for you? Can you remember?
The EMDR was great.
Yeah.
My last kind of stint in rehab, thankfully, was the treatment team had a very solid trauma reputation and had a great trauma therapeutic, you know, treatment.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I started my kind of trauma journey and recovery, was that. So EMDR was great.
Did you do the somatic work, the body work as well, getting back in touch with body memories and the fascia work around your muscles? And
I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, that the muscles store memories, and especially with me, with my body just kind of being riddled with scars, that made a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have you come across the book, The Body Remembers? No, The Body Keeps the Score. That's it, the book. The Body Keeps the Score. Okay. It's a sort of classic text in trauma and therapy about all of those things. And it's partly linked to how the brain is structured, and there are certain different bits of the brain that get affected in different ways by trauma. And so you're getting these services, and you know, in things like EMDR, although they're a challenge, they are actually quite swift as well. I mean, there's sort of, the process is formulaic and it works really quite well.
It does, and I saw the kind of first benefit from these types of therapeutic treatments. My sponsor, the one that I kind of attribute to really getting me on a recovery track, he saved me pretty much. He committed suicide, and that destroyed me.
Right.
And that set me on a 2-year really bad run before I found myself in my last treatment center. But I took the time in treatment to use these methods to work through that traumatic event of my sponsor committing suicide. And I saw the benefits of that, and it really helped me. And that was, the kind of the start of it all. The proof
I was going to say, because you're then processing almost in real time as you're experiencing the event, which would have been a first for you, actually, I imagine.
Yeah, it was.
And then sort of developing resources with other people, getting help to do it. Again, a first in some ways, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
And that is, I suppose, the core of recovery. We've sort of hinted at these things like, I'm just aware of time. We're going to be running out of time soon. But I want to move us on to the recovery. And sort of these groups, AA, etc., don't work for everybody. That's the truth of them.
Yeah.
And particularly, they can be very difficult people who are highly traumatized like yourself. Because to try and talk about that type of material and that type of is just re-traumatizing. So it brings up the memories without a safe holding, without any processing of it. And like I've said before, the memories themselves can be as powerful as the original event.
Well, and I was incredibly resistant because, in my mind, I had a story that no one could relate to because I had this disease that no one in the world could ever have. I was the only one.
Yes, exactly. And it's a medical fact as well. It's really...
It is. And I was like, there's nothing that they could do to help me. They can't relate to me. So I had that resistance going in, which made it harder for me to get on, into recovery. But the more work that I did and the more time I spent around the rooms, I learned that it doesn't matter. There's pieces of everyone's story you can relate to. And that's that shared bond that we all have together.
Yeah.
And seeing the common,
Absolutely. I mean, it's sort of, I think it sounds like the treatment was a stepping stone into being able to see that, because finally people were helping you in real time, were recognizing the depth of your pain and the depth of the trauma. And it was really shit.
Yeah.
Really horrible stuff was going on, man. It must have been really uncomfortable inside you.
It was.
And you're going through this process, and this is when you start to then engage with this creative seed that had always been inside you.
Yeah.
So tell us how that blossoms, how you managed to give that fertile soil and how it's grown over the years.
It's well, first, I had to work through, like probably most musicians do, is that association with the drugs and the alcohol, and enhancing the creativity piece.
That's right.
I also was incredibly stage fright.
It's such bullshit, isn't it? But we all have it.
It is.
Absolute, utter bullshit. If anybody's listening to this who's using and is an artist, it's complete bullshit.
Believe me, and I've learned the hard way. I've tried every which way to find creative benefits with drugs and alcohol, and it just does not work.
I remember, because I was a professional actor for many years, and I remember I would get pissed before I'd go on stage and just think that was normal and okay. And it's just ridiculous. I look back on it now thinking, my God, that must have been awful for people to watch, this sort of drunken idiot staggering around stage. Sort of like, but in my head, it was the best performance in the world. And I'm like, why am I not getting an Oscar? Well,
seriously. Yeah.
Because you ain't going to get an Oscar that way. Seriously.
Yeah. And all I can say now is thank God no one was filming,
Absolutely. That was dreadful, terrible thing to do. So you went through that very classic thing of, these drugs are part of my creativity, which is all that nonsense in the arts that goes on.
I met a buddy. We were in sober living together, Zach Ambrose. So we were on this recovery journey together, and we just happened to have that natural musical chemistry together. And we started playing, and we never stopped. And it's been 10 years later, and we still play together. And then, your life, your life just seems to have blossomed since you sort of essentially got the effective treatment, which allowed you, it sounds like, to rejoin the human race. Absolutely.
You were no longer this strange alien who is locked away with this condition. You were just a human being who'd had some really shitty things happen to them, but you were meeting other human beings that had had shitty things happen to them, but they were also trying to repair their life and themselves. Is that about right?
That's completely accurate. And that's how I met my wife.
Wow.
Too. Going through this process together and us being in that vulnerable position where our lives are very raw, as they have to be, to work through these types of things.
Yeah.
And we just, I knew the second I saw her that, she was going to be my wife.
Really?
There was no question. I did. The second I saw her, I knew I was in trouble. I remember stopping at the top of the stairs being like, who is that? And how do I spend all my time around her?
That's fantastic. What a great, when was that? How long ago was that now, Mikey?
That was maybe 4 years ago.
And how long did it take before she accepted that reality that she wasn't going to get away from it?
She started noticing me coming home earlier and earlier during the day. And then it's just, then I was just home all the time and we were always together and we became best friends. It was fun. She also works in the music industry.
It's a lovely story, isn't it? That you fell for her straight away, but actually the way you got to know her, becoming friends, was very, very healthy, rather than the addict way. Falling in love bomb, all of that sort of nonsense, and
dominating 100 miles an hour.
Yeah. And so you worked on becoming friends. Now, what a revolutionary thing to do for Mr. I'm okay. I'm on my own. I could deal with this thing. Yeah, it's just pneumonia. It's just a heart attack. Don't worry about it. I've got this. And then this sort of beautiful thing called vulnerability.
Yeah,
which is an extraordinary gift.
It is
hard work though at times, I think.
It is, especially since I associated vulnerability and being emotionally sensitive as a more feminine trait, which kind of kept me from admitting to being sensitive or being vulnerable, because I thought it was unmanly as a result of my upbringing. I needed to hold what I thought was a man and to be kind of an emotional wall.
Yeah.
Which is, it's not true. And I am incredibly sensitive, and, being open to that and diving deep into that was probably the greatest thing I could have ever done.
I know. I mean, I've had conversations with you about, and it might be we come back and continue this conversation about what it means to be a man these days, because it's thankfully very different to the images I got and the messages I got growing up, and I'm so grateful that it has changed. I'm so grateful that there were, some very strong women in the 70s and 80s, etc., that said, this is all bullshit. I'm not having this anymore. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, and thank you very much, because my life has seriously improved because of it. And I'm very grateful for that. But this thing about vulnerability, and maybe loop back a little bit before we finish to thinking about recovery and the pandemic. Because, of course, it's been a real challenge for everyone. I don't mind admitting that my mental health has suffered in the last year. So I've had to go back and, I've had to go back and do things like I've started medication again, because I have a mental health survival plan, which if I have a certain level of symptoms, I will do certain things. And that means I don't have to go to a rock bottom again. So I'm very grateful for that. Has similar things been happening for you, and maybe Jess as well? Because
absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. Especially that sense of in-person community with other like-minded people. There's an undescribed power of going to a meeting with your peers and listening in person. And it's great to do it over Zoom, but for me, it's not the same. I've had to kind of up my contact with my support group almost on a regular multi-day basis. And, kind of come up with a daily plan to keep that structure in my life on a day where there's really nothing much we can do outside of the house. So the daily routine has been incredibly helpful, that structure. And thankfully my support group, holds me to those routines. and I can
and
act creatively.
that's a fantastic message to get out there to people, that, you know, it's the opposite of the fantasy of being strong. Is the more we're vulnerable and ask for help, the more resilient we are. That's the term that we use in psychology, is that we develop resilience so that we're not as broken by events. But the longer we hold on and say, I have to be strong, the more likely we are going to be broken. It's that image, isn't it? The image of the reed or the tree when the wind comes. It's better to bend with that wind rather than try and take it on, because, you know, if it's strong enough, the wind is going to snap you. And to be honest, a pandemic is a strong enough wind to snap you, without a doubt.
Sure, it is. And I've had a lot of friends, you know, that need treatment as a result of, you know, the times we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are at the end of the time on the sort of, unfortunately, I could go on forever. I particularly think it'd be interesting to talk about sort of how recovery and manhood and stuff like that, because I think there's some really interesting themes, and also other themes about, you know, going to recovery meetings and feeling different and strange, and identity, because, you know, I don't identify with certain core elements of recovery meetings. I'm not sort of spiritual or religious or any of that sort of stuff, and yet I can find communality within and people can find communality within me. And so I think there's some interesting conversations around that, and also some interesting conversations about good and bad treatment, and those treatment providers. And again, we've had those conversations, but it would be interesting, I think, from your perspective, maybe to come back to that type of conversation, the more in-depth conversation about those types of processes. Inevitably, this has been more of an introduction to this guy called Mikey, who I know and love to bits. And I hope people have got, you know, a real sense of what an extraordinary person you are.
I appreciate that. No, I'm so grateful you and I met in London, and, you know, our friendship ongoing. I'm just incredibly grateful.
Yeah, same here. Same here. You know the saying, I'm tall because I stand on the shoulders of giants.
Interesting. I like that.
Have you come across that? So
I have. Yeah, it's been a while though.
It's how I feel about a lot of the people I know, and you're one of them. So thank you for helping me feel tall. It's been wonderful to have you on. Unfortunately, we do have to finish there, folks. And we'll see you again next week. And as usual, I can't remember who my guest is next week. And one day I'll actually read the script and know these things, but I don't. For now, I'm going to say goodbye. It's been wonderful to see you, Mikey.
You too.
You just hang on there while my team shut the broadcast off, and I'll see everybody again next week. Bye-bye.